Marisa is research assistant here at Satsu Institute of Philosophy. Marisa's research focuses on the philosophical examination of concepts, imaginaries, problems, and ruptures within the history of ideas that may occur outside philosophy but have a significant impact on the modification of philosophy. In particular, Marisa examines how ideas are related to their historical and epistemological conditions. Her main areas of interest are indeed the epistemology of specifically the medieval and early modern period, the history of ideas, post-structuralism, but also theoretical psychoanalysis. And correct me if I'm wrong, but your current project is on the notion of trickery, right?
Yes, still ongoing. Yes.
Marisa has published extensively articles and book chapters in the above-mentioned fields, and the title of her paper today is another evocative title, The Devil Wears Furs, Tracing Faustian Elements in the Contracts of Christoph Haizmann and Sacher-Masoch. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, good morning from me as well. First, I would, of course, like to thank the organizers, Tadej Trocha and Lorenzo Chiesa, for inviting me to participate in this third installment of the To Be Continued conference series. I cannot exactly claim that my contribution today represents a direct continuation of what I presented here over the past 2 years. However, it is in a certain way indirectly connected to the themes of my previous contributions and my broader ongoing interest in questions of trickery and deceit, which will hopefully suffice. Since the abstract of this paper announced a kind of comparative analysis of contracts concerning two fairly well-known figures in psychoanalytic discourse, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch and the equally familiar case of Christoph Haizmann, as analyzed, among others, by Freud, I would like to add from the outset a note that this study remains a work in progress. I'm aware of contractualism. I'm aware that there already exist several theoretical treatments, although short, on the question of contractualism with respect to both bodies of material. However, my aim today is to present a basic outline of what I find theoretically productive in considering these two contractual relations together. At the same time, I would like to keep the focus on one particular figure, namely the figure of the devil, and on one of its specific derivates, namely the act of striking a pact with it. Now, turning now to the case of the actual pact, I'll be examining the case of Christoph Haizmann from the 17th century. Now, this case was unearthed from the archives by Mr. Payer-Thurn, the then director of the Austrian National Library, who discovered a forgotten manuscript in the early 1920s. Now, upon uncovering the manuscript, Payer-Thurn contacted Sigmund Freud, acquainting him with Haizmann's case history. And as a result, Christoph Haizmann became one of Freud's notable cases, which he published in 1923 under the title A Neurosis of Demoniacal Possession in the 17th Century. Now, the manuscript, which includes Haizmann's paintings, diary, and notes from various parties involved, particularly priests who summarize the events surrounding the case, also contains two contracts that Haizmann allegedly made with the devil in 1669. Now, one of these contracts is said to have been signed in blood, while the other was signed in ink. The compiled manuscript is entitled The Trophy of Maria Zele and recounts the story of Christoph Haizmann, a Bavarian painter who arrived at the shrine of the Most Blessed Virgin Mary at Zele in Styria on September 5th, 1677, after experiencing a seizure while attending church in August of the same year. Now, the event is described in the manuscript as Haizmann being seized by, I quote, certain unnatural convulsions to the horror of all present, end of quote. Now, when questioned, Haizmann confessed to having sold his soul to the devil 9 years earlier during a period of personal despair following the death of a family member. Now, presumably his father, although this was Freud's inferred conclusion, in Latin, Haizmann used the expression ex morte parentis, which offers no further specifics about the relationship or the individual to whom he was referring. Now, in any case, the devil is said to have first appeared to Haizmann in the guise of a gentleman accompanied by a black dog. You have it here. The devil allegedly asked Haizmann why he was so dismayed and sad, offering to assist him out of his distress on the condition that Haizmann sign himself over to him in ink to become his son, in his own words, with a promise of aid in every possible way. Now let me read the contracts now. They're quite short and repetitive. First one said, in the year 1669, Christoph Haizmann, I sell myself to this Satan to be his own bodily son and belong to him body and soul in the 9th year. Now this one was written in blood, and the second written in ink. I, Christoph Haizmann, assign myself to this Lord to be his own bodily son in the 9th year, in the year 1669. So one of Haizmann's motives for making this pact, it is suggested, was the decline in his artistic endeavors as a painter and the difficulty in earning a livelihood through his art. Now, regretting his decision, Haizmann then sought to escape the pact just before the 9-year term expired, hoping to free himself from the devil's hold. Now, his journey to Maria Zele in the 9th year of the contract was an attempt to break the pact with the assistance of divine intervention, particularly through intervention of another divine figure, this being the Virgin Mary. Now, the goal was to retrieve the signed contract from the devil and nullifying the agreement made 9 years earlier. Now, according to the manuscript, the exorcism was ultimately successful. After 3 days and nights of intense effort, the devil was summoned to the altar of the shrine. He appeared precisely at midnight in the shape of a winged dragon holding out the pact to Haizmann. In a dramatic turn of events, Haizmann eluded the priests, rushed to the altar, and snatched the contract from the devil's hands. However, the story did not conclude here. After a month of relative peace, upon returning to his sister's house in Vienna, Haizmann's visitations resumed. He was once again subjected to nightly tortures, temptations, and persuasions from the devil. Haizmann endured strange and painful seizures, accompanied by vivid visions in which the devil appeared to him in increasingly grotesque forms. At times, the devil attempted to entice him into signing another pact, offering promises of wealth, power, kinship, and other temptations. Now, when these efforts proved unsuccessful, the devil summoned demoniacal apparitions to employ more coercive tactics, attempting to reclaim the mortal who had, for a brief period, managed to escape his grasp. Now, at this point, another contract comes into play, one that Haizmann suddenly recalled having signed with the devil too, but with ink this time. Now, in order to free himself from the devil's grip for good, Haizmann sought to retrieve the second contract. In May 1678, he returned to the shrine of the Virgin Mary at Zele, where a second exorcism was performed, during which the second pact was also returned to him. Now, following this, the intense visitations from the devil ceased. Haizmann subsequently joined the order of the Brothers Hospitallers, although it was noted that throughout his life, he continued to experience visitations from the devil, who repeatedly attempted to lure him into making another pact with him. Now, however, Haizmann ultimately withstood these temptations, and despite the devil's persistent efforts, supposedly never entered into such an agreement again. So now we can look at some of Haizmann's paintings, his visual representations of the devil. The first image depicts the initial encounter in which the devil appears accompanied by a black dog. Is very Faustian, I think. The narrative intensifies, and by the seventh panel, Haizmann renders the devil in a more traditional form, attempting to obstruct his pilgrimage to Maria Zell. Now, in the eighth panel, because I don't have much time, I can do it only very quickly. In the eighth panel, the devil assumes the typical form of a dragon, appearing to Haizmann after the first exorcism following his first visit to Zell. He's clutching the blood-signed pact in his claws. And finally, there's a triptych painted by Haizmann himself also, which serves as a visual representation of his history with the devil. In the left panel, the devil appears in the guise of a respectable gentleman, and Haizmann signs a pact with him using ink. In the right panel, the devil reappears a year later and compels Haizmann to sign a second pact, this time in his own blood. And at the center of the triptych, this is during the exorcism, the Virgin Mary intervenes and forces the devil to return the blood-signed pact, marking the breaking of the diabolical bond. Oh, sorry, I'll just take a bit of water. Now, there are several moments to be emphasized here when going through the structure of Haizmann's case. Now, first, the contract is conducted by Haizmann being lured into believing that the devil will aid him in his efforts and grant him a better life. The second follows when the contract is due in the very last year of their agreement, and Haizmann realizes that he has been tricked and wants to break out. And the third, of course, were his exorcisms. Now, if the mortal signature originates from a place of powerlessness, it is in an unexpected way followed by an almost emancipatory act when the mortal snatches the contract and gains it in its possession. Thus, the signing of the contract stems from the sense of powerlessness, but is followed by a form of emancipation of the seemingly weaker party. Now, the contract, tainted by deception, establishes an imbalanced power dynamic between the two parties, where one holds the upper hand from the very beginning. Now, there's always a temporal structure present, after which the final execution of the agreement, its ultimate price, is to be paid. And this uncertainty is reflected in the moment that occurs just before, that is, right before the deal is fully realized. The act of returning the contract, attempting to reclaim it, is intriguing, I think. In Haizmann's case, the contract is annulled by forcibly taking it away from the devil, shifting it to the other party. And interestingly, this is followed by a final annulment of the contract and the devil losing his power over Haizmann. Now, in this, we see that the contract from the very offset was not balanced. Rather than each side receiving a copy, the devil keeps the document as an artifact of its ultimate enforcement, while Haizmann has no access to it until divine intervention, embodied in the figure of the Virgin Mary, that enters the picture. Now, the mortal annuls the deception by stepping into the game himself, which from the start could be said to be on an entirely different level. Now recall the beginning of Faust, where the devil essentially challenges God in heaven, claiming he can tempt his beloved Faust, which of course he succeeds in doing, and then the whole pact is resolved again with God's intervention. In this interplay between God and his greatest nemesis, the devil, the truth being God always triumphs, and thus the divine intervention is the only thing that can enable the emancipatory act of the deceit being performed by another than the starting party itself. Now, the mortal now seems only a pawn in their game, the devil being the figure of substitution while attempting to usurp God's place when demanding the mortal soul, and thus attempting to snatch it from the one to whom it belongs, namely God himself. Now, the contract, according to Kant, it can be understood through the dynamics of surrender and reoccupation of the subject's position. When Kant discusses the power of another contract, specifically the marriage contract in his Metaphysics of Morals, he justifies it based on the sexual act, which he views as the ultimate self-surrender of one subject to another, resulting in the complete loss for one that submits to the other. Within the framework of Kant's moral theory, the thesis follows that it is precisely the contract itself that allows the subject's self-surrender to be followed by an emancipatory moment in the act of the reoccupation of one's own place as a subject. And this happens precisely through the other to whom the subject first surrendered to. In short, if I, as a subject, surrender to you when we sign the contract, you automatically surrender yourself to me as a subject as well, since the act is mutual. Through this, we both initially lose our original position. However, because we have surrendered to each other, the act of the signed contract enables the mutual regaining of our positions, this time one through the other, once again. And the loss in this manner, being mediated by a contractual relationship, results in gain. And this is the reoccupation of one's own place as a subject in a certain Kantian sense. So in the pact with the devil, we can observe a certain imbalance made up of the sequence of several interconnected elements. We have a contract that comes about through deception, the unbalance of duties of both, like obligations of both parties, the unbalance of a price or what's at stake, and of the imbalance of power, the contracts consequently being kept by the stronger party to which the supposedly weaker party has no access, and the automatic annulment of the contract at the moment when the latter regains it. Now, in addition to everything already discussed, it's perhaps noteworthy that according to some accounts, a portrait of another prominent contract theorist, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was set to hang on Immanuel Kant's wall. Now, Rousseau's theory of the social contract can be applied to the framework of the Devil's Pact, especially when considering the question of its invalidity due to its inherent deception. In this regard, Rousseau's argument about the invalidity of the contract between a slave and a master offers a useful perspective. While Grotius, for example, argues that such a contract is a legitimate one in which the individual exchanges their freedom for their life, Rousseau regards it as a null and void. For Rousseau, a contract represents the affirmation of the social, where the logic is to exchange natural rights for civil rights, to replace nature with society, and crucially, to receive more than what is given in the first place. Now, in contrast, if this balance is non-existent, the very act of contracting is pointless. Where there is imbalance of power, as described in Hobbes' narrative of the state of nature and the dominance of the stronger over the weaker, it is primarily a matter of the prevalence of power rather than justice. In such a scenario where power rules, Hobbes' concept of the right of the stronger holds, yet according to Rousseau, there's no justice in that, and therefore no legitimate choice. The stronger party already possesses power and thus does not need any additional assurance, and what is already present, namely the imbalance of power, will prevail without the need for a contract. This, for Rousseau, is the basis on which he refutes Hobbes. And according to Rousseau, a contract operates on the principle that one gives all of oneself and in return receives more than oneself back. If for Kant, the contract enables the subject to reoccupy oneself through the other, the Rousseau social contract, in a likewise twist, offers a man to become free precisely through obligation. Now, in this light, we could conclude that the devil's contract is null and void from the very moment of signing, as it is predicated upon an unequal power dynamics. Since it's inherently a deceitful contract, the conditions of its signing, validity, and annulment are thus different. Moreover, because of reoccupation in the Kantian sense is dubious, since, like Rousseau, Kant might regard this type of contract as invalid, the subject's reoccupation or the preservation of their soul shifts elsewhere through the reclaiming of the pact and consequently the victorious annulment of the deal. However, there remains the possibility of an alternative conclusion, one that hinges on the question of who, in fact, is the initiator of the contract and thus the primary agent in managing the pact, the one who transforms it into law. This leads in turn to a further question. Is it possible that in losing everything, the subject, in fact, regains precisely that which is conditioned upon such absolute loss? That is, might the total renunciation inherent in the pact be the very mechanism through which the subject acquires that which was, paradoxically, only attainable through its complete forfeiture? Now that turns our attention now towards another dealings with contracts, namely the masochist contract, or perhaps in accordance with the wishes of the author after whom masochism was named, we might more accurately term it a Sacherist contract. Indeed, the author's greatest indignation was provoked by the inconsistency of referring to the phenomenon using the maternal rather than paternal name, that is, Masoch instead of Sacher. Now, this question, the question of naming, of authorship, and of symbolic lineage, inevitably becomes an object for philosophy, and perhaps even more so for psychoanalysis. It may also help us illuminate how such a contract operates, who in this inverted dynamic can be considered the true author of the contract, and who, in fact, determines the conditions of the relationship, especially given the first impressions can be deceptive, and they might be in this case as well. So here the contract arguably lies at the very core of the structure and views everything else around itself. Sacher-Masoch offers us two contracts. One is titled Contract between Madame Fanny von Pistor and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, dated December 8, 1869. The second is between the author and Wanda von Dunajew, a fictional character from his novella Venus in Furs, but in his life, his wife Aurora. Now, in order to preserve the specific type of relational structure, Aurora at one point adopts the pseudonym of the fictional Wanda, while the author himself, as the creator of this fantasy, assumes and renames the character as a version of himself. Thus, a contractual relationship is established between a mistress and her slave. So today, I won't have time to present all 4 contracts in detail, so instead let me just project them to you as to provide a broader context while I make a few brief remarks concerning the very act of concluding a contract of this kind and its potential validity or invalidity. And Sacher-Masoch references to Goethe's Faust in Venus in First come as no great surprise. The work that the character begins to read, entitled Confessions of a Supersensualist, opens with a variation on Mephisto's line from Faust. I quote, "Thou sensual, supersensual libertine, a little girl can lead thee by the nose," end of quote. There are numerous direct references throughout the text to the figure of a mistress who is repeatedly referred to be the devil or of the devilish nature. These allusions, including citations drawn explicitly from Faust, perhaps suggest more than mere coincidence. They invite us to consider whether the masochist contract, too, should be thought of as kind of a pact with the devil, one in which seduction, power, submission, and sexuality are bound together in a legal and symbolic form. Or perhaps, in turn, that the devil's pact is itself a form of a Sacherist contract, and thus can be argued that it has a form of such validity, even in Kantian on Rousseau's sense, and thus couldn't be proclaimed as false. Now, according to Deleuze, in the case of Masoch, it is precisely the contract that regulates love. It formalizes it, verbalizes it, and constitutes the necessary condition of the masochistic love relationship. At the same time, the relationship between the two parties entering into such a contract emerges through a kind of inverted dynamic. What we are dealing with, Deleuze argues, is a victim who seeks out and raises, educates her own executioner. Yes. The masochist is the one who draws the contract. The sadist, by contrast, despises contracts and requires institutions, whereas the masochist requires contractual relationships. Fundamental masochism, then, is neither material nor moral, Deleuze maintains, but purely formal. And at this point, Deleuze arrives precisely at the juncture where Haizmann's pact with the devil and the Sacherist type of contract, as delineated by Sacher-Masoch, may be brought into contact. He notes that the medieval period distinguished between two types of commerce with the devil, which he then links respectively to the examples of sadism and masochism. Both are associated with possession, yet each corresponds to a different conception of it. The first involves diabolism through possession in the sense of being taken over, while the second involves diabolism by means of pact of alliance. As Deleuze writes, I quote, "The sadists think in terms of institutionalized possession, the masochist in terms of contracted alliance. Possession is the sadist's particular form of madness, just as the pact is the masochist's," end of quote. If we introduce this into this equation, the element of suspense and waiting, which Deleuze identifies as a formal characteristic of masochism, this temporal dimension may contribute to the unraveling of a visible feature in Haizmann's contracts, namely the fact that the duration of the pact is explicitly defined, 9 years. And Freud links this with the anticipation of birth, specifically the 9 months of pregnancy, drawing a parallel to traits found in Schreber, such as the impulse to give birth to the world, to oneself, and so forth. This points to a crucial motive of rebirth and the role of the mother, one that is discernible in both Masoch's and Haizmann's cases. Now, in Masoch's contracts, one can observe a certain escalation or intensification of the clauses, while the first contract is characterized by a degree of reciprocity between the two parties. It specifies a fixed duration, 6 months, and preserves certain rights. For instance, the right to work, I quote, "She shall allow him 6 hours a day for his personal work," end of quote, or the right to honor, I quote, "shall not demand anything of him that would dishonor him in any way as a man or as a citizen," end of quote. And the second contract is considerably more radical, having eliminated these elements. It states, I quote, "Anything pleasant and enjoyable that I shall grant you will be a favor on my part, which you must acknowledge with gratitude. I shall always behave faultlessly towards you, but shall have no obligations to do so," end of quote. Now, at this point, there's no longer any right to name, honor, or even life. And here Deleuze concludes that the function of the contract is to establish the law, and once the law is established, it becomes increasingly cruel. In doing so, it transfers symbolic authority to the figure of the mother. As he asserts, there is no masochism without a contract. If the contract presupposes the will of the contracting parties, defines between them a system of rights and obligations, concerns no third party, and is valid for a limited period of time, then it is indeed the generation of law, a generator of law, even if, crucially, it exceeds and ultimately negates the very conditions under which it was born. The contract acts as the progenitor of law, yet simultaneously gives rise to a law that tends to forget its origin and seeks to abolish the restrictive conditions from which it emerged. And perhaps paradoxically, it is conceived in its very original intention by the victim itself, the seemingly weaker party who, through the act of signing, appears to relinquish everything, even their name. For what it is at work here is a specific inversion. As Deleuze observes, the masochist is insolent in his excessive servility, rebellious in his submission. I quote, "He subverts the law in his own way," and also, as Deleuze puts it, "he stands guilt on his head by making punishment into a condition that makes possible the forbidden pleasure." Now, the conclusion may be aptly captured in the words of Theodor Reich, who in his work on masochism writes, I quote, "The masochist exhibits the punishment, but also its failure. He shows his submission, certainly, but he also shows his invincible rebellion, demonstrating that he gains pleasure despite the discomfort. The masochist is flexible. He cannot be broken from outside. He has an inexhaustible capacity for taking a beating, and yet knows unconsciously he's not defeated." So I'll conclude here now. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can open the floor for questions. I can ask you a question.
Sure.
Yeah, obviously my mind went back to Freud's underestimated text. That's a really great, indirect case study in 1923, etc., on Haizmann. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Freud's general take there on the question of the devil and what he calls repeatedly like evil will is quite ambiguous, because on the one hand, he seems to be saying all the time, basically the devil doesn't exist. Psychoanalysis shows that these are projections, really like, ABC of psychoanalysis, projections of ambivalent feelings towards the paternal figure. So basically, possession is the consequence of basically repressed wishes gone sour and projected outside, right? But then on the other hand, that's the passage of that text that always fascinated me. He also says something, psychoanalysis has much more to learn from demonological treatises than from attempts at explaining diabolical possession in a kind of like physiological, not but diabolical, but somatic way. So basically says, instead of like looking at well, even probably, like psychiatry or proper medicine or today cognitive science to explain this phenomena, we should read demonological treatises, so I don't know if you have like, my question was like, do you have a stance on Freud's stance on these matters, or you just like draw from him, in a kind of open way? Yeah.
Yes, of course. Just to add, as I said at the very beginning, I think the project that I kind of have before me is quite lengthy, and it has many different perspectives that I would really like to go and analyze them further, because I find them super interesting, especially as, the connection that you did here with superstitious or like demonological possessions that have a specifically like very historical character, and then connecting them to, psychoanalytic practice and reading the symptoms and trying to kind of translate them here from one to another. I find here very interesting also, like I didn't want to put Freud on the side or claim at all that, that his text is not great and adds to many different layers of understanding Haizmann's neurosis. Especially the part that I found very, very interesting was, but I wasn't able to get into it due to the time frame and everything, was the temporal aspect, as well as this, Deleuze really emphasize the temporal aspect and the timing and waiting and the entire suspension when reading Masoch, which is like super evident in Venice in Furs, is very, very important aspect of Haizmann's case as well. I wasn't able to explain that, but the two contracts that we have here, they are quite intriguing in a sense that one appears after the other miraculously after the symptoms come back after the first exorcism, and the Holy Fathers at Mariazell, they didn't even know for the second pact to exist until the return of Haizmann, and then again the scribe that tries to sum everything up in a manuscript tries to make sense of what's happening with the years here. The time doesn't make any sense. And I find very intriguing Freud's comment here that says that, Haizmann is always kind of out of time. He's never on time. One pact is dissolved too early and the other way too late. So I think there's something there as well that is quite productive for analysis, especially in the connection to masochism. But yeah, I always remember of also, I think, Certeau's writing on history. There is also quite a short study of his interpretation of how Freud read Haizmann, and he adds something to it in a sense of maybe let's try to read it also historically, and offers a bit of different perspective. So I would.
As you said, there's so much to be.
Yes, it's quite hard to pack it into one.
1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Could I get some more water?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't really have questions. Thank you for that. I think it's topics that's really, really very actual. If you consider that the pact is in front of the text of Jean-Claude Miller about Me Too, it's published in Slovene in Problemi. It goes directly to this problem of the contract and the pact coming forward in contemporary times. So obviously this is a huge project, and there are many details that one can go into, but have you noticed that both stories are exactly 200 years apart? So one is 1669, the other is 1869. And the two pacts are quite different in details. I mean, Haizmann, when he signs with his blood and in ink, there are very interesting details that one should be particularly attentive to. For instance, on one hand there's the Satan, and this side there's Lord. Son is written on the left side with a small letter, on the other hand with a capital letter, etc., etc. So there are many fine details, exactly as one should be very attentive to the two pacts of Masoch, because one of them is written in the third person, the second one is written from the perspective of Wanda, and the deleted part is we, as two subjects. So it's and somehow just the final remark, when you were speaking about the time, I think Lacan's reading of Hamlet could be of help here, because there's huge time, and the Hamlet's time is time of the other. So you are talking about asymmetric, positions here. So I think that could be helpful. So,
great comment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you a question, maybe that's also too big for a question, but about the seriality or almost circularity of contracts. I mean, there seems to be something like a compulsion to repeat at work, because it's never just one contract, it's at least two or even more. And I wanted also to point in this context to a work by the Czech surrealist filmmaker Jan Schwankmajer. It's called Lesson Faust, where we have exactly this topic of a protagonist signing a contract with the devil. And then, of course, when time, which is also an important aspect of all of these contracts, it's always, there will be a moment to pay, and once time is running out, once this moment is nearing, then of course the protagonist tries to reclaim and somehow to annul the contract, which with Haizmann still seems to be working. Haizmann, but by means of a sort of divine intercession or intervention. But of course that possibility seems increasingly vanishing, I would say, later on, to the point where in Lesson Faust, one protagonist in the film is actually replaced by another, who is doomed to repeat in a sort of temporal loop the same mistake and to go through the same story time and again. So do you do anything of this compulsion to repeat and sort of temporal circular structure that is inscribed in contracts of this kind?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for the comment. Yes, I think the emphasis on repetition is, quite striking, because even in the story of Haizmann, I just quickly noted it when speaking, but it has absolutely this character. I find it interesting that you have kind of like a double repetition, the need of Haizmann or I guess the devil urging him to repeat the contract, to have a double pact in place, so that it can really hold, and then also when the pact is abolished, the visitations don't stop. The transcriber, at the end of the manuscript, noted that until his death, Haizmann was repeatedly visited by the devil, but was so strong in spirit that he was able to resist him and not sign another contract. So it seems that he was kind of haunted by the devil right until his death. I guess then it was the done deal, because the soul already went to someone else. So I kind of find that interesting as well as this other doubling that also Sigmund Freud emphasizes in his treatment of Haizmann, of the doubling of the Father and the God and the devil as a sort of inversion of God, but not quite. I mean, I had to shorten it here a bit, but I also find it quite interesting also when reading and researching a bit more on the superstitious and especially cases of possession in medieval times. I mean, I know that this is already done in the 17th century, but you know, it is intriguing time that follows the Middle Ages and also carries certain traces of it, and you could claim that it kind of emphasizes certain things that were only showing up in the previous period, and then became really, really accelerated in the time after. And here it's also, what I wanted to say, yeah, sorry, I lost it a bit, but there is a certain repetition at work there, that it's also connected to counting, to expecting the end of the time, etc. So this temporal aspect is something that it's inherited here, I think, too. I hope I answered a bit.
Thank you.
We have time for one final quick question.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I just wanted to throw this out there because I couldn't help but think of like, okay, what would be like a kind of contemporary contract that we're all familiar with, and I thought of like terms and conditions, and that there's so many websites where you automatically have to kind of scroll to the bottom, and
Sorry, I have a bit of difficulty hearing you.
You know, like terms and conditions. If you go on to many websites have this where, or you know, your iPhone or different kind of devices, you kind of have
like
to go.
Like small print, you mean?
Yeah, the fine print. But increasingly, I mean, I think no one really reads them. I guess you just kind of go. You can kind of scroll to bottom and then accept. So I guess just like with that kind of also kind of endless sort of signing that we do, I just had like to wonder what you thought about, like, is that a kind of masochism, or is that like us making a pact with the devil? And yeah, is it even a contract if we don't know the terms? It was just sort of speculative thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest question that I had that was kind of following through the entire text here was, you know, can you claim the validity or invalidity of the contract of this kind, or what kind would suffice to say, okay, this one is valid or invalid or false. But yeah, I didn't really. I mean, I get what you mean, and the fine print is. Yeah, you could say that, you know, it is a part of the contract and contracting relations that we have now. But yeah, maybe
The devil in the detail.
Yeah.
Bad joke.
But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know how to answer that, honestly.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Marisa.
Thank you.
Please join me. Great. Great.